So, you want to take it from here, Alberto?
Okay, thank you, Sandy, and thank you for being here. I'm so happy to be here with you and with Sandy. I've been working with the Vermont group for about 5 years. Do bear in mind that although I was born in the US, but English is my second language because my mother was Colombian, so when I was very young, we went back to Colombia, and I've been back and forth between the US and Colombia during all of my life. I did a last minute change in my presentation. I don't know if it happens to you. When I was hearing all that I've heard from the past 2 days, then I thought I'm going to make a change. And the big change is that I'm going to begin by the end of my presentation, which are the takeaways, as you see, the second takeaways. And I'm going to begin by saying how important ISPS is. I think I've been linked somehow to ISPS in the 1970s. Basically ISPS International, more recently with ISPS-US. I'm seeing looking at the past conferences of ISPS, both the international ones and the ones in the US. I went to New York, I went to Portland last year, we went there, and here.
In Maine?
No, I didn't go to Maine, no.
Oregon.
To Oregon, to Portland, yes. There was one in Maine?
Portland.
Is that Portland?
Oh, right, okay, right, the other part, okay. And then I was thinking, I've been involved in this, I'm a psychiatrist by training, a physician, a psychoanalyst. That was the 3 things you did when you trained in this area in the 70s, right? You became a physician, a psychiatrist, and a psychoanalyst. That was kind of the 3 things to do in the 70s. And those of us who've been struggling to make, let's say, changes in psychiatry and the way mental health is understood and so-called mental illness is understood, seeing less conferences of ISPS than this one, it came to my mind, maybe the mission has been accomplished, in a way. I said, this is, because I remember the first meetings of ISPS, I only saw the very first ones, just psychiatrists, physicians, and now, I don't know, but I don't think there were many psychiatrists today, I'm one of them, but I don't think it's a clear minority, which I think is, which is interesting and good. And families are here, people with lived experiences are here, and most important of all, as you will hear in a second, one of my main goals which was to encourage that the leadership of the recovery process should be done by a person who has suffered whatever he has suffered. And I say, oh, this is already happening. So maybe the change is there, and maybe it's solid. But then I thought that, but then I think, well, this is true, but I'm traveling a lot. The past 6 years I've been traveling the world a lot, and I see things like you see here in the ISPS, but you also see that the old style official psychiatry is still very strong and getting stronger. So for me, for example, just for you to imagine my doubts. In August, I went to the World Psychiatric Association International Congress in Lisbon, in August, and here I'm here. And I see that things have changed and things have not changed. So they've changed, but they're kind of weak. The change is still kind of weak. It's very easy to go, as we like to say, backwards, which in our world it means back towards something, all right? So those are the 2 things that are happening, but that's something. So ISPS is very important because of what it means and what it represents worldwide. ISPS-US is very important. There's a very small ISPS group in Colombia, which I tried to form about 20 years ago, but it's very weak, it's not moving. But there are other groups that are kind of have a similar philosophy. So that's one of the first things I wanted to say, how important it is for groups like ISPS to keep alive, and to just keep on meeting, because the struggle is still there. There's a lot of tendency to go completely backwards, and it's so easy. I mean, it takes 20 years to move forward, but it takes about 2 months to go backwards, And in 1 second, you can change things in the wrong way. The second thing I agree
with you, especially at this time that we are living in South America.
Right, yes, right.
And maybe just to add, we see fewer psychiatrists, but that worries me.
Okay.
You know, the psychiatrists, some came yesterday and then they left.
Yeah, that's not good, I agree.
It's not good.
Yeah,
We should
yeah.
have more and more psychiatrists here, knowing that there are choices.
Absolutely, because unless we change the things in psychiatry, no, the
So
thing
then
is
we
going to
just
be,
have two divisions,
is going to be very weak, yeah.
isolated
I
from each other.
entirely agree. The second takeaway I was going to say at the end, but it's now at the beginning, is that I think there are a couple of secrets, let's call them secrets, we all know, and we've always known, no? And that I want to, I did disclose during the presentation, but I'm doing it from the beginning. So one is that we've always known that it is possible to recover from so-called mental illness. We always known that, and humanity has always known that. I mean, there's always been experiences of people who have recovered, who have undergone those sort of conditions that we call mental illness. That has happened since old times, no? So the thing is, it's strange that we kind of say that we have just recently discovered that it's possible to recover. No, that's always been known, but it's not. It's kept kind of a secret that it's possible to recover, because we know it depends. Basically, I think that's another well-kept secret, that it depends on the attitude the person takes towards his own so-called mental illness and to who accompanies him in that process. No, when people are accompanied by get into this sort of states, and they are accompanied by people who think it's impossible to recover from those situations, then that becomes, how do you call them, a self-fulfilling fantasy. No, it happens. No, and that was the case with psychiatry. No, psychiatry in the past officially declared that it was impossible to recover from mental illness. That you would once in the old language say once a schizophrenic, always a schizophrenic. No, that was what was said 30 years ago, and that you needed medication for life, and that became true because people thought that, and then you saw the people and you register the people who were under those statistics, and people who did recover, who were those who got rid of the psychiatric system and quitted their therapist and tried to struggle on their own, they recovered, but there was no register of those recovery. You would just see, they would be called patients, you didn't know about them anymore, no? But many of them recovered, of course. Some of them maybe not, but many of them recovered. So those things are known, and we've known them for years. Our own road to understand that was, there was a historical information we always had in Colombia, which was what happened in Cuba in the 60s. I don't know if you're aware of that, but after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, in the 60s, there was a big change in the psychiatric hospital of La Habana. And when Fidel Castro decided that that hospital had to enter the philosophy of the revolution, right? And I knew the person who was in charge of that, a psychiatrist called Dr. Diaz Ordaz. And he told me that what he decided to do, the message was that he had to encourage people in the psychiatric institution, the old style asylum, to work and to do art, right? And people began to recover just because of that. No, so that was an experience that I knew in 1970 or something like that, which again proved to me that that was true. And there's also this historical experience with the Egyptians that people forget. There are lots of historical records of how, when they built the pyramids in Egypt, and they took people who were diagnosed as whatever language it was in the slaves, diagnosed with severe mental illness, no? And they put them to work in the pyramids. As you can imagine, those were not the best working conditions, no? Slaves and whatever. But there are lots of evidence that those people who at least were working in the pyramids recovered much better than those who were left in the old Egyptian wards. So there's lots of evidence that, of course, you can recover from so-called mental illness. And then much before we had those beautiful studies of the talking about Vermont, the study at Corning Harding did in the Vermont longitudinal study, where it was beginning to be proved scientifically that at least 0.5% or more of the people who have once been diagnosed are recovered in spite of psychiatry, not thanks to psychiatry. That was what those studies showed. So we've always known that, you know. And then our goal began to be from the beginning. We decided to understand what is it that those people who have, what's the common thing of those people who recover from so-called mental illness? And then we began to see lots of things, but one of the things I want to insist a lot, at least this is our experience in Colombia, that's where we did all these studies and we've been doing for the past 50 years, was those people who really were able to become independent of the mental health system. You know? Those were the ones who recovered. It was very difficult to recover within the system. You know? And also those who were independent from their family. That doesn't mean, to be independent doesn't mean that you have to leave your family, or doesn't mean that you have to leave the system. It means that you use them according to what you need, no? And your needs, not their needs. No? So those people who are able to really handle the system, the mental health system, and their families, or create a new sort of family that suits their needs, those are the people who really recover. And also the people who understand the importance not only of taking care of their needs, but the people who discover how important it is to recover, to take care of the needs of others. As you will see in a second, what one of the main conclusions in our experience is how the most powerful tool for recovery is for people to be able to help other people in their recovery process. No? Probably that's what many of us in the mental health field do. I mean, when we were young, probably, as I said, we had to decide when we were teenagers if I was going to be a so-called mentally ill person or a psychiatrist. No? And I decided to be in the team of the psychiatrists. No? And that was a way to handle my own difficulties. So it's been known that a way to recover is to help others. And that's so important, no? Because when you, as you'll see in a second when I'll say a bit more about what we're doing there, those people who discover how powerful it is to help other people in their process are those who really kind of recover. And the other thing I'm going to, as I mentioned, for those who just arrived, I decided to change my presentation and talk about my last slide just at the beginning to show you where I'm heading, from the beginning. For many years, we were convinced and we thought that those people who underwent so-called psychotic experiences, they lost time in their life. It was, if someone was in a so-called psychotic crisis for 2 years, or for 5 years, or for 10 years, there was a sense that they lost those years in their lives. That may be slightly true up to a certain point, but this is neglecting and denying all the very important things that are achieved during the struggle of a so-called psychotic crisis. I'm going to stop using the so-called, but please remember that when I use those horrible words, it's always so-called, right? So all the things that are learned by that, and all the skills that a person who has undergone those situations and have overcome them have afterwards. Lots of skills that we know about now. And in our program in Bogota, we're especially dedicated to study those things and understand the skills, the very important skills that people who recover have and have achieved. So, and this is very important because this allows people to have a sense that they didn't lose 5 or 10 or 15 years in their life, which is cruel, no? And it is not true, no? It's just that what they have acquired is typically not really valued by others. And as I'll show in a second, this came very clear to us because we, in my group, we've been very involved, maybe if you've heard about it, with all the peace process of Colombia. You know that recently in Colombia there was a peace process signed between the government and the guerrilla, And I have been very personally involved in all that peace process of Colombia. I was part of the government delegation in the talks with one of the smallest armies, the ELN, and whatever. So in a way, I'll tell you about that in a second, we put the two processes together, the process of recovery of the people in our program and the process of reintegration of the people from the guerrilla into our society. And we discovered doing that, and we make it evident how useful it was for the people who had been in our program recovering from psychosis, and how well they did in helping the guerrilleros reintegrate into our society. They had undergone their own reintegration process. Most of them have moved many years ago from psychiatric hospitals or whatever into the society, so they're kind of experts on that. And that was a very powerful tool for recovery. So that was the last part. So I'm going to begin the presentation. I'm just going to talk for about 15 minutes because Sandy's going to talk a lot of interesting things after that. So just to let you know, in 1982, this is a long time ago, I remember I visited St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, and I presented our statement of philosophy of what we were going to do. And this was the statement of philosophy that we used in 1982. I had lost this statement. I discovered it about a while ago when I was preparing what to bring here. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. Bear in mind, this is 1982, right? But it's kind of interesting to read it again to see what do you think about this nowadays, no? 1982, this is what, 50 years ago, 82, 92, 40 so years ago? I don't know. And the idea was, at that moment that moved us, was how people who are diagnosed with all this are forced into things, all right? They're forced into families, forced into hospitals, forced out of hospitals, forced into medication, forced out of medications, forced into certain lifestyles, forced out of lifestyles. They're always forced by so-called experts. There's always some experts telling others, and the others are the ones who are suffering with whatever, you have to do this. And this has always been the case. I hope we don't begin to force people into open dialogue now or whatever. No, it's always a tendency to force people into things. But at the same time, there's a tendency not to hold people accountable for that, no? At the same time, no? But you're not responsible if you do this or whatever. So accompanied self-rehabilitation, which was the language we used in 1982, our approach was to change all this, no? And to force people the least possible, but to hold people accountable for their acts as much as possible. It's interesting that this was something that, just to tell you a bit of story, this is how we began to work. So 40 years we've moved from an asylum-like institution to a town-like institution. That was when we changed we had to work in having a different sort of institution, but nevertheless an institution. And then we realized that the institution was different, but nonetheless an institution. And then we created this concept of a therapeutic town in a place where the main values of a therapeutic community that we used to have were taken by the town. And they said, this is not, the mayor of the city close where we worked said, okay, what you're doing in your therapeutic community is not only good for people diagnosed with some of those things, but it's going to be useful for any people. So that's when we kind of decided to create this concept of a therapeutic town. And then the fourth step, we don't know, no? And that's something I've been asking myself, what comes after this? And that's why I began with the other slide, because can we say that we made the big difference? Can we say that now the leadership of the recovery process is really in the hands of those who are suffering from whatever they are suffering? Can we just let it go? And my answer, as you heard, is yes and no. There are lots of progresses, but there's still a very big risk to move backwards. We had some basic principles in accompanied self-rehabilitation, which are this, from the beginning, which we thought from the beginning that it was very important and still very important to acknowledge all that we ignore. No, it's the starting point for our approach is to acknowledge that we really don't know a lot of things. and that acknowledging that gives us the only good reason to really change and accept that the person who has the problem has to have the leadership of the process, and that that person has to become an expert in themselves, and that that person has to redesign their own lifestyle, and that those are the four main principles. And the other part, I'll talk about that later, but those four first are the principles that have guided all throughout our process. The other thing that happened is that some of you might know Rex Haig. Rex Haig works in London. He has a therapeutic community there. And I'm using his 5 shared values of the therapeutic community just to let you know that these 5 values are the main values that were taken by this mayor of the city that we call this therapeutic town near our program. They were taken by the mayor of the city, and he decided the town should have the same values you're working with in your so-called therapeutic town. And that's why I brought that slide, just to remember you that that's what guided us. The other thing that's very pertinent to say today is that this began in 1982. In 1992, we decided that our program should be assessed and evaluated by someone who was really expert and an outside evaluation of what we were doing. Someone who would really let us know, okay, what you're doing is good and people are recovering or they are not. We first thought of psychiatrists in Colombia, and where I live. And then I decided this is not going to work, because psychiatrists in Colombia are divided, as far as I'm concerned, into 2 groups: my friends and my enemies. So the evaluation would have no credibility, because some people would just say this doesn't work and others would try to comply with me. And that is a huge coincidence, because that was the moment when I tried to look worldwide and I say, who can help me with this? Who's a really, and then somehow we got to John Strauss, at Yale, here. And this was 1991, because one of my colleagues, Esperanza Diaz, a psychiatrist that now works here at Yale, some of you might have heard of her, she knew about John. And we said, we need a psychiatrist, but we need a special psychiatrist, a psychiatrist that values alternative ways of handling things. And then the only person we found, and we looked a lot worldwide, was John Strauss here at Yale. So that was the first time I came here and had a coffee at Atticus Cafe in 19-something with John Strauss. And that's where I had lunch with you today. I wanted to celebrate that. And then John Strauss built a team. And the team was built basically with him and with Larry Davidson, who was also here yesterday. So it's very strange for me to be here. It's a lot of strange coincidence, sort of. And Esperanza Diaz, of course, was part of that, and Courtney Harding was part of that, and another, Janice Jenkins, another person some of you might know. So they did an evaluation, a very careful 3-year evaluation of what we were doing in the 1990s. And we took it very seriously. I remember I told John, look, you assess what we're doing, and you tell us. If this was worthwhile continuing, we'll continue. If we should close this program, we'll close it. If we should continue with some modifications, we'll do that. I won't get into that evaluation results. Those are published. I can tell you where. But that was very encouraging, and that's something I encourage people to do, to really do a very serious evaluation of what anybody is doing, because it's the only way. The struggle with certain sectors of official psychiatry is very difficult, and if you don't do this stuff, it's going to be very difficult. So that was a very important turning point, and as I usually say, this was my passport to the scientific worldwide community. This study that really supports that what we were doing, somehow people were recovering in a better way. So that was the other thing we did. Here's it. This is the one I want to show now, which is also called the takeaways. Forget about the word takeaways now. As I was mentioning, at a certain point when we moved from the therapeutic community towards this town, we began to invite the people in our program to pair themselves and work together with lots of elderly people that lived in this town. This is a town that many elderly people live. And this pairing of people who had recovered or were in the process of recovery from so-called severe psychosis, and the elderly people proved to be a very powerful tool for them to recover. And the second process of pairing was the one I already mentioned we did with the people who were just reintegrating from the guerrilla groups in Colombia. So those two mixes kind of confirmed to us the importance of what we now call mutual recovery, no? That the only way to recover is that if you're mutually recovering. And we now think that always when we did old-style psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or whatever, or any sort of therapy, both the so-called client and the so-called therapist were kind of changing and recovering, but that was not acknowledged. No? And now in our program we acknowledge that completely, that the only way to really move forward is if both parties are changing and both parties are growing and both parties are kind of recovering. So that's a concept we now use permanently. The other thing was this idea that came to us about meaningful jobs. Of course, any job is meaningful. No, I always clarify that. I'm not saying that there are unmeaningful jobs, not at all. But some are more meaningful than others, probably. And what we mean by meaningful is a certain activity that is valued by a certain community as something very important. And if you ask me now, we now think, and we've seen, because we've continued to use all these assessment tools that we learned from John Strauss, and we are able to see how people recover in a reasonably scientific sort of way. And we now think that this opportunity of being involved in a meaningful job is one of the most powerful things to really recover. We have had two experiences with that. One is the people in our program recovering, helping elderly people in their life process. And the second one is people in our program helping ex-guerrilleros reintegrating into society after the peace agreement with the FARC was signed. These are one of the two main priorities in Colombian community. So as you can imagine, this strong sense of acceptance by a community, not only that you're tolerated by a community, but that you're valued by a community. No, and that the community says, come help us with one of our two main programs. It's incredible how once people who have undergone all sorts of difficult emotional states, once they are involved in an activity that is recognized by a community as something very useful, then they become to get involved in that. And this is very important. We were talking about this yesterday with Sandy, because sometimes many mental health programs struggle trying to encourage and accompany the people in their program to work and to do things. But it doesn't work if the work is not needed by the community, not only needed by the person and by the therapist. It has to be something the community needs and valued by a community. That's a very strong thing, much stronger, because my residents, students, everybody's saying, I cannot encourage that person to work. He doesn't want to work. But why would he want to work? If this is not like an exercise of working, no, it's like exercising to work. It's the force that drives you to work is that another person needs you. That's what happens to all human beings. No, we work because our children needs our work, or another one needs our work, or whatever. So for some reason in mental health systems, trying to encourage people to work, once this is not there, it's very difficult to make it work. That's why we think that what we call, for lack of a better word, maybe you can think of a better word, meaningful jobs are so important. But meaning by meaningful jobs, something that is recognized by a community as a big need, so that the person really is convinced what I'm doing is needed by the community, not just by me. The other thing we kind of realized in this past years is that we've done a pretty good job up to a certain point in deinstitutionalizing people diagnosed with mental illness. That's more or less okay. But we forgot to deinstitutionalize caregivers. What do I mean by that? That caregivers, including all sorts of caregivers, including therapists, including family, including whatever, including psychiatrists, no doubt, and I'm a psychiatrist in a process of recovery, let's say. We were not so good in changing that, and that's what has to do with what we were saying, no? And if we are not able to change psychiatry and change the curriculums of psychiatry, it's going to be very difficult, you know, to really make the change we've achieved a solid one, that it's not so easy to move backwards. No, that's, as I was saying, those who have just arrived, I realized the difference of such a progressive meeting of the one I've heard here in ISPS in New Haven, but I was 2 months ago in the World Psychiatric Association Congress in Lisbon, and I see the two forces are right there, and they're not talking to each other very much. A few of us kind of move in the two worlds, but it's something we have to really think about. And also family members, we have to be accompanied in making changes in in how they conceive so-called mental illness.
So, Alberto?
Yes, of
Is there
course.
somewhere where you can say something more about independence from this and the family?
Independence from,
Does that have to do with deinstitutionalization?
do you want a bit more of that? Yes.
Or you mean of the caregivers?
Of the caregivers, yes. I mean, changing of the caregivers, right? We change the mindset, you know? Change the way they, their attitude, understand. For example, if you remember the statement of philosophy, that we insisted that the person has to be as accountable as possible for what happens to them, using common sense, of course. I'm not talking about extreme cases. But many family members and many therapists have to understand that the responsibility for their loved one or their patient or their client or the whatever is limited, no? That they also have to change and accept that people are accountable for themselves as far as it's reasonable. No, of course, not to extremes. And but that has to. If you don't change the mindset of therapists and caregivers, all that we've done is not change. Yes, you would.
Well, it's interesting because, and you mentioned the mindset. In my experience, we have so many people from the system applying to work at Inner Fire, in Vermont also, and the caregivers hate what they're doing. They're seeing no progress, but they have to earn a living. And when you appeal to their heart, they are mother, father, sister, brother, and they know so many people. Every day they see people who are stuck on these beds and not moving forward, and they're trapped. And it's remarkable how many people are no longer prepared to leave their heart behind when they go to work.
Right.
But
Yes.
and that's how you can call that out for them to listen to that part of themselves and help change.
Probably a way to answer your question, which I know I have not answered it yet, is just to tell you, for example, nowadays, I spend at least 95% of my time in our program in Colombia accompanying and helping caregivers, you know, to cope with a very complicated situation in which they don't know how to cope with the changes in the mental health system, right? But and they are hated by everybody, no? So you have to help them, no? Because they are in a very difficult situation. Clients are much better off now, no? And somehow, no? They're more free, they're able to choose a bit more, but caregivers, including families, are in a very complicated trap, no? And I think we have to accompany them and help them to make a change that is in accordance with the other big change we're making, no? And what's their role? They have to change their role, no? Many caregivers know what their role was with the old style psychiatry, but they don't know what their new role is going to be. There is a very big role, no, we think, but it's going to be very different from the old role, no? So, yeah. I think I already spoke about yes, let me move a bit more, because I think I'm on my time, right?
Yeah, we're,
What, 5 more minutes?
yeah,
or-
no, that's fine.
Are you sure?
Time, yes.
Okay, this
Can I
is
ask
the,
a question about the town?
yes, of course.
Well, what it sparks for me is like, I remember first coming across like Geel, Belgium, and I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that, right? Like, is that being the epitome of how we should like attack mental health crisis, you know? And we've known about that since the 60s or whatever, like the whole town, right? Like the government pays people to partner or to board people that go there to seek asylum or whatever. It just sparks a connection, and I'm wondering if you, obviously probably familiar with that, but if you like have any thoughts into like that model versus like what you're doing in Colombia.
Thank you for bringing that. Yeah, I don't know if you know about Geel. Geel is a lovely town, small town in Belgium. I visited for the first time 2 months ago. You know, after I went to the Psychiatric Congress in Lisbon, I went to Geel. I had wanted to be there about 20 years ago. I've known about Geel forever, and because each time I talk about a therapeutic town, they tell me the first therapeutic town that was described with Geel in Belgium. You know? And so I decided I have to go to Geel. Have you been there, Sandy?
No, I have.
It's a very interesting place. It's been there for years, not only for years, and there's a story, a legend that there was someone there who kind of cured people diagnosed with mental illness. But what's real about Geel, which is very interesting, is that all the people, the citizens, which is our theme in this meeting, the citizens of Geel were very welcoming to any person with a mental illness, and that people who had a mental illness went to Geel, and anybody in town got them in their houses, and they received them in their houses to live. And that was still happening, so I learned 2 months ago, until very recently, when finally the psychiatric system, that's my view, no, took hold of what was happening in Geel. It's been taking control of what was happening there about 2 years ago, and it's working in a different way. They have the psychiatric hospital now, which is a kind of, I would say, typical quasi-old style psychiatric hospital, and one of the programs of that psychiatric hospital is this housing in Geel, no? So, but it's under the control of psychiatry now, which is a problem, no? But it gives a feeling of safety to people. So they supervise, so they assess anyone who wants to go to live to a house, they assess the person, and then they go to the house to live with the people, which is still a good thing sometimes. But yes, it is an interesting, it would be very long to talk about that, but I know the experience. Our experience is very different from that, yes, is very different from that. What we've been doing is just this fact of, well, not completely different. The clients in our program did move to live in this town, bearing in mind that the people in our program were all homeless people, no? So they moved to this town, and we have this activity of pairing between our clients and the elderly, our clients and the people reintegrating from the guerrilla, and this working with these concepts of meaningful jobs. You know? So it probably shares the philosophy of Geel in the sense that we've worked a lot to create this welcoming attitude of families and people in Sopó, which is the name of the city near Bogota, where we call it. Therapeutic town was not our word. It was a word by the mayor of the city of Sopó, who decided, I'm going to do a town with the values of a therapeutic community. And that's why he called it that Sopó was becoming a therapeutic town, because he was going to use the values of a therapeutic community. No? So it was his name. I'm concerned with time. I think
No,
I should stop.
No, you've got some more time.
Sure?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So just to finish, the other elements that we use a lot in our approach is the importance of taking reasonable risks. One of the difficult things about psychiatry, and I found it especially difficult about psychiatry in the US because of legal things, and I understand it why, is that it's very difficult for a psychiatrist or a therapist to take risks, you know, because there's a big fear of being sued and whatever have you. And it's very difficult to recover if you're not willing to take risks and allow the person to take risks. I mean, it's part of life. I mean, any person who wants to achieve something has to achieve reasonable risks. No? So if you are kind of anti or aversive to risk, it's very difficult to find a recovery. We talk about over there, we've tried, we accept that anybody can choose, not forced, but anybody can choose to use medication. But in our program, we do our really best to do recovery without medication. We are working together with a group in Norway, who's just begun a recent an institution of recovery for severe psychosis without medication. And we like to try that, and we invite people that are willing to give it a try without medication. Of course, we respect perfectly well all those people who decide to use medication, but we think that it at least should be a choice for people who prefer to recover or give it a try to recover without medication. So in our program, we do our best to do everything without medication, and we do our best to help people who have decided to get out of medications but haven't been able to. We do our best to help them to get rid of medication in a technical way, which is very difficult, and it takes years sometimes to get out of psychiatric medications. But that's just a choice. We're convinced that the only way to move forward is that at least if one is not outside of the health system, one has to be at least very marginal to the health system to really be able to recover. We've changed all the diagnostic and prognostic tools and research tools. We think that this has to be redone. So we don't use DSM-5 or any of the DSMs anymore because we think that all those classifications are full of stigmas and prejudices, and it's very difficult to recover those tools. So we think that the only way is to really get rid of those tools and think of new ways to, of course, we have to diagnose. It's a normal activity of scientific thinking. But I think we have to kind of delete and try to think of new ways to diagnose and do prognosis, and new ways to do research and understand what is going on. And we think that doesn't mean that we don't value old research, but we think we have to revisit old research and look at it from a different perspective and see the sort of thing we can conclude. So I think I'm going to stop here. We'll have some time for discussion because I want you and people want to hear you, Sandy.
Okay. So I think you can see why Alberto's work has been such a source of inspiration for us. I work for a community mental health program in Vermont, and in particular, there's a lot of ways that we've been influenced by Alberto, but this project, Community Bridges, that we've just begun over the last year or so, is particularly inspired by the story of Sopó. And I'll explain the artwork a little later, but you know, the construction in the background, this is very much a project still of itself under construction, so I thought it was kind of a good image to start with. So this one?
Yeah.
In terms of the impetus for the project, you know, I think we've just become increasingly clear in our program that as much as people are struggling with symptoms and a lot of different kinds of difficulties, the disconnection and lack of inclusion is maybe one of the most impactful things that people are struggling with, and that we really need to be much more centrally focused on that in the work that we do. And I also think more broadly that this needs to be how systems are organized. Community mental health systems should be targeting this, and that this should be a much more central focus of research. I'm really proud of ISPS for putting as much emphasis on this as they do. Also, we've been reflecting on our experience in our program of ways that we actually get in the way. And you know, there's practices like confidentiality, which is there for a very good reason, and yet, you know, it's something that gets in the way of our ability to help people make certain connections that we think might be helpful. We've also been thinking about how our, you know, as community mental health programs go, we can do a fair amount with the folks we see. We have an ability to see people several times a week, to be out in the community, to really spend a lot of time with them. And that's really valuable, and I really believe in it, and maybe there are times where that also can get in the way. And particularly because we're still in formal helping relationships, and I think this earlier discussion of kind of a, you know, well, I had the good fortune to hear about some work in the Trieste region of Italy, and they said, well, we've been working on deinstitutionalization for 50 years, and we need to keep working at it, that it's a long-term project. And that was helpful to me, because that helps me realize that we still, I can think in Vermont we've gone a long way, and I think we have, and yet there's still vestiges of institutional dynamics in our work. And
Is that the independence idea?
yeah, I think it relates to that, and you know, I think you were talking, Alberto's discussion of reasonable risks. I think part of where we can start to reinstitutionalize is when we start to worry. And you know, like risk management might say, well, you can't help two people connect to share rides because what if there's an accident and we might get sued, and so let's not do that. You know, or you know, worrying can lead to coercion. So you know, that's just one example, but I think it's there was contemplative psychiatrist back in the 90s who had this phrase of institution mentality, that there's this kind of mindset that it can appear in relationships in an instant. And so I think that's similar to what we were talking about earlier, that there can be this sudden dynamic of that just recreates itself very easily. So, you know, I think for those in the provider roles, that's something we need to keep working on. And that our relationships then are, you know, they're important helping relationships, and yet they don't replace the kind of organicity of relationship that people can experience in their community lives. And then finally, in terms of kind of reasons for this project, just that we need to find new ways to break down stigma. Our agency recently discontinued one of these well-known community education models because it was so heavily based in mental illness language, and there is now a lot of research that says that that can kind of backfire and reify perceptions around that people already had around mental health conditions in a way that isn't the goal of those campaigns. And so, you know, I think what the research is also showing is what works is getting people together, doing stuff together, and experiencing their similarities of, you know, we're all very, very similar beings. We're the state-designated mental health center for Addison County, about 37,000. We have a really diverse mix of staff. In our county, there's 2 larger towns, Middlebury, where we're based, and Bristol. And then I would be in big trouble if I didn't refer to Virgins as the city of Virgins. That's their preferred identity, and so it's important that we're clear about that. And in our program, we serve about 160 people. This is the county, just south of Burlington there. So certainly for this project, Alberto's work and the story of the SOPO becoming a therapeutic town was a big impetus for us to try to see if we could create some similar experiences. And I think the invitation from the mayor, from the town to say, we want you here, what you can bring is important to us, was very inspiring. Harder to know how to create that. The focus on meaningful roles. And I heard on Friday the term from the Yale citizenship project. They talked about valued roles. I think that's also a nice way of conceptualizing that. The experience of the pairings was something that really struck us, and of course the emphasis on the client leadership of the process, both of their own recovery, but also more broadly in the experience of SOPO. And then also from Alberto's work is this concept of accompaniment, which really we work in a lot of different helping stances in our program and different kinds of relationships, but I think accompaniment is a really nice theme that goes across all of those and is maybe it's more of a normalizing kind of concept of being with that doesn't have to have the kind of baggage of clinical treatment systems. So that's been a compelling concept for us. We've also, over the last several years, been putting a lot of effort into applications of open dialogue. I'm not going to speak much about open dialogue here, but I think we're now one of the 3 largest and kind of longest standing community mental health applications of that approach in the US. And I think the ways that helped us move towards this project is certainly the focus on personal networks being really one of the most important things to focus on in treatment models. It's also helped us in terms of a way of holding meetings and planning for the project in a way that's, you're looking for something to happen out of the conversations that generates something that wasn't there before. And polyphony, which is something valued in open dialogue, is one way of helping to bring that about, to really make sure we're hearing the different voices and perspectives. And I think we've also found that it's really been a catalyst for us to work more truly from values that we've held for a long time but haven't always embodied them all that well. And I also think that it's helped us, when we're having dialogic network meetings, those external things that influence treatment adversely become more transparent. And so if we're worrying about something because someone in our agency thinks we might get sued, somehow that's going to become more vivid in a dialogic network meeting. So I think it's really helped us to go more purely in the directions that we feel are most important. And then I think the other thing about open dialogue is that it really comes down to valuing the human experience, to just be listening and responding on a very human level. And when we're talking about experiences of connection and disconnection, that's a fundamental human need. There's nothing that you need to clinicalize about that. That's just something that we all rely on to survive. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to the Trieste model, which is just a very recent influence. But they've done some really innovative work with community inclusion in connection with these projects that they call micro areas. So they're like a little tiny day program, but they really make themselves useful to the communities in which they're located. They go knocking on doors and find out if there's anything they can help with. So they've become these community resource centers. And then there's also these social cooperatives, which I think is supported by law in Italy. and people in social cooperatives have a guarantee of access to employment. So the guiding themes of our project, that we work from a normalizing framework, that isolation, disconnection is something that affects everybody from any kind of background in life. I think there's a lot in the media now about the health effects of isolation. There's a lot of research coming out about that. And so when we're engaging people in the process, this isn't something that people with mental health challenges struggle with. It's something that a lot of people, any of us, could be struggling with. And if anything, it's I think, a kind of epidemic condition in our times. So along those lines, it's also important as we're having meetings and gatherings and events that we do it in a way that's not identifying of, I'm here as the staff helper for this, and this is our person with the mental health challenges who's involved in this, and then you're the person from the community. We deliberately try to mix that up and not inadvertently do any kind of identifying of roles. If someone wants to say, yes, I'm here as someone who's struggling with mental health challenges, that's entirely fine, but we don't want to be saying that for them if that's not how they're choosing to identify their participation. I think something from Alberto's work that's really important in this is the concept of mutuality, that we're looking for relationships where there's some sharing both ways in a very kind of very lateral level. Certainly participant leadership in the process of recovery, and then also as a groups, planning groups, we're looking for leadership from our participants. The need to get this away from the clinical space and really focus the project away from our clinical models of service delivery. Working from a not knowing stance. So we had a lot of ideas heading into this, but we don't know which is going to work for who, or maybe there's things we haven't been thinking of that are much better ideas. And so we've really tried to offer some things, but also stand back and see what else emerges, and leaving room for dialogues that generate something we hadn't anticipated. The concept that getting people together and doing things together is one of the best ways to combat stigma. And then, as Alberto was saying earlier, we also really want to be careful that this doesn't become another thing that we push on people, nor should we pathologize solitude. And as a card-carrying introvert, this is an important point to me, that there's a lot of benefits to taking solitude or taking space and not always being engaged. So the ideas that we had heading into this were straight from what we were hearing from Alberto and Sopo, so a focus on meaningful roles, including, we figured that those who are working with us and getting this project going could be an example in itself. We wanted to work towards these pairings and then also see what else came from the people we were meeting with, as other ideas to generate connection and involvement in the community. So we did some training and consultation with Alberto. We realized we needed some money, and so we tried a couple of grant applications, which neither got funded. So then we decided to start anyway with a planning group and try to have a mixture of people, from staff, from clients. We had a pastor from a local church, another retired pastor from our board, and we decided pretty quickly to get our meetings out of the office, out of our buildings, and into a community setting. So we've been meeting in the Middlebury Town Hall. We started some outreach to community groups to just say what we're doing and see where is there some, where can we help, where is some interest for their involvement. And then I realized that we had to create some staff capacity, so just squeeze some money out of the budget to create some roles to work on this, as the sole focus for a few folks, or part of their jobs where they had some designated time. So we created 2 pure staff positions, and then reassigned some time from one of our clinicians to work on the project. And the project staff, the project leader now is a peer staff person. And then last spring, we had a kind of open house event for the project with Alberto telling the story of SOPO, inviting people in to hear about that. And then most recently, we've had a series of one-time community events to help build momentum for the project. Some things that we learned as we were getting started was we had a lot of ideas and we were trying to do too many of them. And I think that also was a problem with our grant applications being just hard to follow because there's so much in them, which I think also meant that we needed clearer descriptions of the project. I think we're running into, and this is something that shows up in supported employment research, that clinicians and case managers aren't often the best predictors of who can work. And I think this is also true for this project, that I'm not sure our staff are always the right ones to be saying, hey, you should get involved in this. And I think we do have some unlearning that we maybe need to do in resetting some of our assumptions, which is something we've also experienced with open dialogue. We also learned that as much as we want to validate people's experiences with stigma, that starting with that, I mean, we want to start with a positive of you have something to offer. And yes, stigma is there, it's impactful, it can really be very difficult to deal with, but leading with the idea that everyone has something to offer. There was some frustration with the pace of the project that was voiced, and there's been this tension between how much do we reach out to the community versus if we go too far with that, are we getting ahead of clients' interest in a way that could then feel like pressure to them to do something they don't want to do. So there's been some back and forth about that. What has happened since we got started is a community art project which generated this artwork, which was done together. We advertised it, and then in the public library, people worked on these mandala designs. There were children coloring and painting on them, and so this was something that the town was looking for artwork to put over the fence that was going around the construction happening on the railroad bridges. So we made our contribution to that through this. We had a team of participants participate in Green Up Day. For those of you not from Vermont, this is the first Saturday in May. People go out with bags and pick up trash along the roads. We've now got an ongoing planning and support group that's peer-run at our wellness center to work on this project and generate ideas and directions for the project. They also arranged to kind of get themselves, support each other in going to some free concerts that they wouldn't have otherwise gone to. A group of them also went out and did some gleaning of apples from an orchard to bring to the food shelf. I think one of probably our most successful events so far are these games days that are being held at the Commons is an apartment facility, mostly with senior citizens living there. And so we have a group of people bringing cards, board games, good food, some music. And this last one we had, there was like 10 volunteers, and more residents came out the second time to participate than came the first time. And just folks seemed to really have a lot of fun with that. And then just Friday night, there was a Halloween dance fundraiser to help one of our local charities have resources to buy Christmas gifts for children. And this was done in collaboration with the Turning Point program, which we were chatting about some earlier. So it was we worked with another community group to have that happen. I haven't heard much about it yet. I'm kind of eager to get back and hear what happened. Last week I went and sat down with the peer support group that's working on this, just to hear what they would want me to share at this presentation. And I laughed and I was thinking, okay, well that was nice, but maybe not as intrapsychically profound as I was looking for or something. But it was half an hour. It was just a brief discussion. And then I was thinking more about it, that no, maybe this is exactly what we're looking for people to say, gee, that was a nice gathering, it's good to do things for other people, you know. I mean, these kinds of comments are maybe exactly what we want to be hearing, and just the experience of being part of something. And when the folks brought the apples into the food shelf, the person at the food shelf was very moved to say, you know, to see that, you know, these were some people who had also used this resource, but here they were contributing something back, and they expressed their, just how much that meant to them. And I think there's also good feedback from the group about the need to keep promoting the project, and that some of the things we're going towards next are going to be a little more difficult. So we do want to try to move more towards the you know, ongoing roles that people develop, so moving away from, or continuing with one-time events, but also having people get more involved in things in ongoing ways. And we do want to establish some of the kind of pairings that Alberto was describing, where people are in these kind of mutual support arrangements in more of an ongoing way. We need to better describe and get some better messaging out about the project. And we want to resume our outreach to other community groups. I think we've got to continue to try to move this away. We need the institutional support of my organization now to keep it going, but when we can get at the resources to be more freestanding and get it away from us, I think that will be better. And at the same time as getting that part of the project away, I think there is more individual work for us to do, you know, in ways that I think Alberto describes with accompanied self-rehabilitation, and when we are in individual therapies and individual work with people. Also, really linking with other projects around community education, community awareness. In our agency, we have a resiliency project that's being run by our youth and family program. There's an effort to try to get a kind of trauma awareness project going, and we think we can do a lot with community bridges to help hold a space for some other kinds of dialogues and discussions of important issues in the community, but doing so in a way that hopefully doesn't inadvertently do any re-stigmatizing of things. We wish we could do some research about this, which was one of the reasons why we went for grants, but I think we can find some resources to do some qualitative interviews. I thought of using, there's some scales around social isolation that we could do before and after. We looked at community attitude scales, and frankly, they're all pretty laden with illness language, and in a way that we were uncomfortable in choosing to use them. So I'll stop here. I don't know if there's anything else you would say about this project from your vantage point, Alberto, if we just want to open up for discussion.
15 minutes for that.